Sit down and set this coat right beside my laptop, and I stopped him. I got his coat, and I set it several feet away. Okay. Let's begin. Let me have your attention. Let's begin. It's my privilege to welcome you to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Seminar Program. I appreciate the good turnout the day before a major holiday. I know a lot of people will be traveling, and I encourage you to be really careful. There's going to be more traffic on the highways this year than any time in the past because fewer people are flying, and so please be careful. Today's speaker is Dr. Mike Guidry, who is a professor in the UTK Department of Physics and Astronomy. Mike received his PhD in physics from UT in 1974. He served a postdoctoral appointment at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab from 74 to 76. And then he was a visiting scientist at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1979 and 80. And he's been an adjunct staff member at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory since 1976, which is the same year that he joined the UTK faculty. Mike is an old friend of mine. Many years ago, his son and my oldest son played soccer together when they were little bitty guys. And so we used to stand and watch soccer games together. The topic of his presentation today is interactive animation and web-based educational technology for the physical and biological sciences. Mike, welcome.
The only correction I should make is my degree from UT is actually in chemistry, not physics.
Oh.
Whether that's good or bad, you have to judge. I'm just getting a crash lesson in using this thing here, so you may be in for some humorous attempts on my part to figure out how to use it. I want to tell you something about things we developed over the last 3 or 4 years, primarily associated with advanced educational technology. And I put on the screen here a list of some of the things actually, I'll just point here, a list of some of the things that we have been working on. There are a number of projects, and there are some off the screen here that are new projects. But the 2 or 3 that I'm going to concentrate on in the discussion today to give you some examples are Online Journey Through Astronomy, which is our complete web-based syllabus in introductory astronomy that's marketed by Brooks Cole. And if there's time, I'll show you some examples from 2 projects we just completed for Prentice Hall in the biological sciences, a student companion to Essentials of Genetics, and a similar companion for introductory biology. But most of the examples that I will show you in order to illustrate the kinds of things that we're doing will be taken from Online Journey Through Astronomy. So let's see. Get rid of this. No, actually, I didn't need to get rid of it. I just needed to bring this to the front. Nope, wrong one. This one, which one is? There it is. I actually gave a talk in the physics department a couple of days ago, and I forgot to put a list of collaborators up, so I'm going to put this at the very beginning. Here are some of the people that have been involved in the things I'm going to show you. There are other people who've been involved too, but the people here have played a central role in the examples that I'm going to show you. So let's see. Before we actually look at some examples, let's talk a little bit about why we might be interested in doing the kind of things. Double tap. Okay. Aha. Doing the kind of things I'm going to talk about. Let's see, that is, no, I keep touching the wrong one. Why do it is right? I think there are at least 4 reasons why the kinds of things I'm going to show you could have some significant advantages in teaching. The first is the idea of distributed learning. The World Wide Web literally is worldwide, and that means that the syllabus can be accessed from anywhere that one has a web connection. You don't need a book, you don't need a CD-ROM, but of course you do need a web connection. The kinds of things I'm going to show you can actually be put on a CD-ROM too, but one of the hallmarks of what we develop is that all of it is web deliverable. It's then trivial to copy it onto a CD-ROM if you want it on a CD-ROM. The second issue is instant updating. A significant discovery in astronomy today can be part of the syllabus tomorrow, whereas with a normal textbook, the time scale for new editions is typically 2 to 3 years, although some publishers are actually going to even shorter schedules in very competitive fields. But typically, a revision in a textbook takes 2 to 3 years, whereas in a web-based product like the ones I'm going to show you today, you can, in principle, update every day. You probably don't want to do that because it's not going to make you popular with professors if you evolve the syllabus out from under them. But it is important in a field like astronomy, where there are new discoveries essentially every week that will eventually make their way into the textbook, to be able to do this kind of update. The third thing is that the revolution in World Wide Web technology of the last several years allows a highly interactive learning environment, and we're convinced from our experience, and I think there's a lot of data to support that, that interactive learning is likely to be more lasting learning. That is, watching passive animations and so on is useful in many contexts, because often an animation will illustrate something that can't be illustrated well in a still image or a textbook. But what's really important is to engage the student and have the student interact with the program and have the program respond in various ways depending on the way the student responds to the program. And then the fourth thing is that I think well-planned electronic publishing should be more cost-effective than traditional textbook publishing. Now, of course, you can always waste money in lots of ways, and that doesn't necessarily mean that this is true, but in general, I think it is true that with well-planned electronic publishing, one can deliver material in a more cost-effective way than with traditional textbook publishing. But for all the reasons that we could give for using the web, we can give even more for not using the web. The fact that there are more on the not list than on the yes list shouldn't be taken as a particular bias on my part. But there are a number of problems associated with trying to use the web in education. The first one is just the hype factor. And this has gone down a little bit since the dot-com bubble burst, but a lot of discussion about education on the web is overblown hype. Bad teachers putting stuff on the web are still bad teachers. And you can't solve a lot of educational problems just by putting them on the web. So first you have to cut through the hype factor. Second, how do you keep, if you do creative interactive animation, how do you keep it from becoming just a video game? The common student statement that I hear all the time, I'm a visual learner, often is shorthand code for I have an insufficient attention span to deal with difficult concepts. Therefore, I'm a visual learner. If you show me a simple picture, I might learn something, but I'm not going to engage my brain beyond that. Well, we have to do better than that, and therefore we have to keep it from becoming a video game. There's also quality of experience issues. I'm deeply involved in doing these kind of things, but I for sure would rather read a lot of text from a book than from a present computer screen. So there are issues of quality of experience. We got to do more than just read text off a computer screen if we're going to make this a quality educational experience. It is true that the kinds of things that we're talking about represent a revolution in information technology, And I suspect that history eventually will look back on the development of the web as comparable to or maybe even exceeding the invention of the printing press in terms of its impact on society. But information by itself is not education. The web gives us the ability to distribute information in a much more efficient way, but that by itself is not education. There are issues associated with quality of information, and there are also issues associated with information overload. If you take your Google and you type in some search word, you can find thousands of sites that have something to do with that search word, but that doesn't mean that reading the material on all of those sites is going to necessarily educate you. Then, there are some more. Will students feel that they've been abandoned if we go to more electronic delivery? This is both an issue of substance, but it's also a psychological issue. Even if the students have not been abandoned, if they're not used to this kind of approach, they may feel that they have, because they feel like they need that cushion of an instructor standing in front of them speaking to them. And finally, there are issues associated with equipment, which I think are less important than they used to be, but still play a role. Although the situation is changing rapidly, not everybody has a broadband connection and a high-end PC. And does that mean that if we go heavily in the direction of these kinds of technologies, that we begin to cut out people who are disadvantaged? So there are a number of reasons why we have to be cautious about the way we apply this to educational applications. Okay, what about, let me say a brief word about technologies before I show you some examples. I gave a brief list here of the basic technologies we have employed in the development of stuff over the last 3 or 4 years. I won't spend too much time on it because I'm not going to make this talk primarily about technology. I'm mostly going to make this talk about showing you pretty pictures and animations and showing you some of the possibilities. But I want to, before I start, give you a list of the basic technologies that we're using. And some of these we're not using so extensively anymore. We used all of these extensively at one time, but for instance, Perl, Director, Shockwave, and Lingo are things that we used early on, but we now have largely replaced those with newer technologies. So in fact, most of what we are developing now, the interactive animation, is being done either in Flash or in Java, and it's packaged often in HTML, and we often use JavaScript to control Windows and so on. But these are really the two central technologies that we are concentrating on in the development of interactive animation in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, so let's minimize this, and now let's get this back up, and this. And let me show you some examples from Online Journey Through Astronomy of how we are using this technology, in this case, in an interactive syllabus for teaching introductory astronomy. And I think I've already got that one up there, in fact. So this is a page out of Online Journey Through Astronomy. I'll go back in a minute and show you the entry to the thing, but this is a particular page in Online Journey Through Astronomy. And one of the things let's see, I'm going to remember how I'm going to do this. Okay. Smartboard learning curve. One of the things that I want to show you is how we do images in Online Journey Through Astronomy. This is a complete interactive syllabus for the first year of introductory astronomy. It is completely online. So it's sold by the publisher with a password, so you access it online. The files are small enough. I'm going to show you some of the technology that leads to the files being small enough in order to do that. And it's built around 350 interactive animations. That is, we essentially wrote a new astronomy textbook, but instead of writing a textbook and then asking what kind of web support could we develop for the textbook, which is sort of the traditional way that things are done, have been done, we, in this case, developed the entire textbook around 350 interactive animations. We also have a lot of still images embedded in Online Journey to Astronomy, and I want to show you an example here of a still image. I want to make the point, I had it on an earlier transparency, but I think I didn't point it out, that although it is rather uniformly agreed that this is the state of the art in electronic technology for teaching astronomy, this entire syllabus has no GIFs, no JPEGs, no MPEGs, and no QuickTimes in it. Now, for those of you familiar with web technology, those are sort of the staples of standard web technology. We actually have none of those anywhere in here in any direct form. Now, I'll show you in a minute. We actually do have embedded bitmaps inside of vector files because sometimes the original images are bitmap images. But there are no GIFs, JPEGs, QuickTimes, or MPEGs anywhere in the thing. Okay, so this is an example of a vector image, and you saw, let me do it again, you saw that one of the things that happens is when you click on any image in the book, it launches in its own window. And that window is extendable to the full screen without losing resolution and without transferring any more bits, too. And the reason is that this is a vector graphic image. It is not a bitmap image. It is done entirely with vector graphics. That has a number of advantages. One of them is file size. You notice this is not only an image, it's a smart image because we can put buttons on it and do things like that. So even the still images in the book are a kind of very simple animation, or can be a kind of very simple animation. Let me take a poll. How large do you think this file is? 150 kilobytes? 4 kilobytes. It's a big variation. 4 is closer. It's actually 9.7 kilobytes. And if you're, yeah, right, you win. You win your very own smart board. If any of you are familiar with web files, it's very seldom, unless it's a button, that you have a bitmap image that's that small. But this is not only a very high-quality image, it's even an image that we have a very simple animation embedded in. It is an image that can be resized at will without losing resolution, and is less than 10 kilobytes long. So this is the reason we're using technologies like this, because if you're going to deliver it over the web, and you got a half a megabyte file that you got to deliver in order to get this kind of quality at this size, that's not going to work very well unless somebody has a really fast connection.
So what's the trick?
Well, it's because it's vector graphic.
Right, what is that? I understand the first word and the second word, but
yeah, okay. Which part of vector graphic? It's because the image is not bitmap pixel by pixel, but it is generated basically by a formula. And because it's generated by a formula, the computer has hardware, software that can do that very rapidly. And therefore, when you resize, it doesn't have to transfer more bits over the pipe. All it has to do is redraw the screen according to the formula. And that, for the kinds of things that vector graphics are well adapted to, is very fast. Now, vector graphics won't do that for everything. If you've got a photograph of trees with leaves on it, and you want to show that at very high resolution, very high quality, the bitmap is probably a better way to go in that case. But anything that can be represented in terms of putting together a lot of basic shapes is a very good candidate for efficient vector graphic technology. So that's the basic reason. There is another issue too, and that's compression. That the file is that size first because it's a vector graphic file, but secondly, it's also highly efficiently compressed. The SWF format, in which flash outputs, is essentially a very efficient compression algorithm that generates very small files. Okay, there are some other things you can do here. Now, this is when it's going to get really tricky. I may have to go over here. just momentarily. So you can do things like this. No, wrong one, right button. You can zoom on a picture or an image, for instance, like that. Again, you see you lose no resolution because it redraws to full screen resolution whenever you change the size. You can also do things, this is going to be the really tricky one here if I can remember how to do this. You can also do things like, there we go. But now, yeah, you can do this sort of thing, which, well, okay, in this case, which happens to be, by the way, getting back to a little bit of astronomy, this happens to be a model of a supermassive black hole engine in the center of an active galactic nucleus. So if, not the kind of nucleus that you worry about in nuclear engineering, but the nucleus of a galaxy, if you were discussing this with class, there are very important issues, for instance, about the black hole is here, there are jets coming out of it here, there's an accretion disk here, there's a dusty torus around it here, there are clouds here that are, I remember I'm not supposed to be in front of it, there are clouds here that are very close to the black hole, and because of Kepler's laws, because of the strong gravitational field, are moving at very high velocities. The lines coming from these clouds are highly Doppler broadened. The lines coming from these clouds, which are further away, are much narrower because since they're further from the central black hole, their orbital velocities are lower. So if you were discussing this with an astronomy class, you can see the advantage of being able to blow these things up and being able to move the thing around and talk about individual things. You can also see the advantage of this kind of thing if you're dealing with explaining things that have a hierarchy of scales, because you could have a vector graphic image or animation that you can just keep blowing up and going down to whatever scale you put into the thing. So those are some examples of the kinds of things that you can do with such a vector graphic image. Now let me go on to show you something about some animations, because I can show you some other images here too. For instance, in this case, this is entirely vector graphic. In the case where we actually have observations incorporated into the image, well, actually, maybe I'll just at least show you. Here's an example. In this case, this is another, here it is. This is another example of a vector graphic image, but in this case it has an embedded bitmap. So this part of it is vector graphic, but this is an embedded bitmap because that's actually an observation. This is a radio telescope observation. These are all embedded bitmaps too. So I do have embedded bitmaps in the things. These were probably all originally JPEGs, but the entire thing is encapsulated in a vector image, which then can be rescaled and so on. And if you blow this one up, you'll see you do lose resolution in the bitmaps, because the bitmaps have only a certain amount of information, and unless you transfer more information when you scale it up, you're going to lose resolution. But you don't lose it here. This file is a little larger. It has it has 4 embedded bitmaps in it, so it's about 39 kilobytes long, but that's still a pretty short file when you consider the amount of information that's here. Okay, so let's get on, though, to the more interesting thing, which is some examples of interactive animation. And I'm going to illustrate it by looking at the concept of the center of mass, which is a very important concept in astronomy, but it's also a concept that students in introductory astronomy students are typically non-science major students. They're typically freshmen in the university. Some number of them are highly motivated and a large number of them are not. And the primary motivation is they have one lab science that they have to get on their record in order to get out of the university, and this is it, and that's what they're going to do. So the challenge is that these people have very little math background. They faint at the sight of algebra and trigonometry, so they have a lot of trouble with math. On the other hand, the challenge is, besides that, The challenge is that for a lot of these people, this is probably their only brush with science in the university. And therefore, it is a challenge to try to at least convey to these people the basic idea of how science works. So the center of mass, as I said, is very important in all aspects of astronomy, but it is a difficult concept for these students. But on the other hand, all of these students were in kindergarten once, and when they were in kindergarten, they played on seesaws, probably after that too, but they played on seesaws. And whether they know it or not, they know about the center of mass, because they figured out where the center of mass is when they were balancing seesaws on fulcrums. So what we did in this case is we wrote a little calculator. This is actually written in Java in this case. The previous two images that I showed you were done with Flash in a vector format. This calculator is actually done in Java. And what you can see visually here is that you have some representation of two masses with the center of mass between them, and you have a set of widgets here that you can, let's see, what do I have to do? Okay. So for instance, I can change the distance between them here. I can change the mass here. And you see that geometrically we do some things in order to illustrate schematically what's happening. We make some assumption about the relationship between diameter and mass, obviously. But we want to convey the idea that the mass is changing. Change the other mass here. And you notice that as you do all of this, the position of the center of mass changes. But in addition to this visual picture, which now we hope ties to their intuitive knowledge that they really do know something about the center of mass, no matter how scary the topic is, we also are printing out dynamically the numbers, and we're also solving dynamically the algebraic equations that actually are determining where the center of mass is. That is, if you'll notice, as I move the sliders, the numbers are changing in the equation. So we have many calculators of this sort that are specifically tailored to tie into some visual aspect that these students may be more comfortable with, and then try to smuggle in a bit of the math and science down here. And it also gives the instructor some options, because if you're teaching jock astronomy, you can sort of hide this part. And we thought about putting a button that said, "No, this frightens me, take it away," and then you click it. And then it would be replaced by a picture of a hood of a car with a button that says, "Look under the hood." And you click it and this comes back. So this allows the instructor to teach this at more than one level. You can teach it at the very introductory level by concentrating on the intuitive picture here. But if you want to be sure that the students understand mathematically what's happening, then you have all of the details being solved dynamically here. So this is an example. This is an example of let's see, actually, let me go up here. That's interesting. It let us in without a password. Okay. It let us in earlier without a password, but now it wants a password. Avert your eyes when I type in password. Let me show you another example. In this case, also a Java applet. This is an illustration now of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Or actually, well, it could be planetary motion, but it also could be a binary star system. This is a Java applet, and it is running pretty fast on this system. Slow it down a little bit. Did that actually slow down? It's too slow. Oh, a bug. All right, okay, there we go. So this is a Java applet. It illustrates the motion of two objects around the common center of mass under the influence of gravitational attraction between the two objects. So, for instance, this could be a binary star system. The center of mass is here. Center of mass is at that point, and there are the two masses revolving around the center of mass. You can now, with this applet, change a number of things. For instance, you can change the mass of one of the objects here. So again, actually, you're seeing the effect of the center of mass that we saw in the earlier thing. So these things would be used together. You first introduce the concept of the center of mass, then you introduce this, Kepler's laws. You can rescale here. You can change the eccentricity of the orbits, dragging slider here. You can illustrate what ellipses are by doing things like that, because the orbits are ellipses. In this case, you can hide the orbits. You've got a lot of detailed information about the orbit being printed here, and you can stop it at any point by clicking there. It starts again by clicking there. You can hide this information if you just want to watch the motion and so on. So what you have here is a lot of information available in interactive animation, in this case done in Java, which allows you to explore what happens when you have two objects, gravitating objects that have angular momentum, orbital angular momentum, so they're revolving around the common center of mass for the system. So, for instance, one of the things you can do is you can make one of the masses much larger than the other one. Rescale it to get back on scale here. Let's make it more. And then you see the traditional picture of Kepler's laws that you see in textbook for the solar system, because if one of the masses is much larger than the other mass, it is on an orbit around the center of mass, but the orbit around the center of mass is inside the body of the sun in the solar system for all the planets, and therefore it looks as if the sun is approximately fixed. It will look even more approximately fixed if we make this mass less. It looks as if the sun, in this case, is approximately fixed at a focus of the ellipse. But in reality, by going back and forth between these things, you can see what's going on. So, these are examples, a few examples, of some of the interactive animations. As I said, there are about 350 of them in this entire syllabus. Not all of them are as ambitious as those. Some of them are simpler. Some of them are more ambitious than those. But those are representative of the kinds of things that we have. I'll show you one other one. The last two were done in Java. This one is actually done in Flash. Again, it's something that expands to the full screen. And I guess I didn't say it last time, but in the last two things that we're looking at, but I'll explain here. All of the interactive animations in the thing launch in their own windows. Encapsulated window in which there's a frames display, in which on this side of the window there's complete information about what the thing is and instructions on how to use it. So if you scroll down here, you have a lot of information about what this is, which is actually a realistic model of the Algol binary star system. And at the bottom then there's some specific usage information about how to use it. And this is true of all of the interactive animation we've developed in Online Journey Through Astronomy. All of it launches in an encapsulated window. And that has two big advantages. First, if someone wanted to use this in something else, it's very easy to move it to something else because it's encapsulated in its own directories and it's encapsulated in its own windows when it launches. And so technically, in order to put this into something else, you just have to move some directories intact, and then you just have to link to one file. You have to know what that file is, but you link to the one file, and then everything that's here follows. So this makes, for organizational purposes, this makes for a nice organization. Now, I won't go too much into the details here. Let's see, can we expand full screen? I won't go too much into the details here. I just want to show you another example on some possibilities. This is a binary star system called Algol. Anybody ever seen Algol? You can see it with a naked eye. It's a star that about every 60 hours appears to decrease its brightness a very large amount, a little over 60 hours. It decreases its brightness by a considerable amount for a short period of time, then it goes back to its original brightness. And the interpretation is that we know a lot about the system. It is a binary star system in very close orbit with about, well, you can see the time here, This is the apparent light output from the system, because this is almost 100 light years away. So we can't actually resolve these two stars. We just see the integrated light coming from the stars. But what happens is it's an eclipsing binary. So when one star passes in front of the other one, it decreases the light output. But this star is much brighter than this star. This is also a more massive star, as you can tell by the motion around the center of mass. Even though this one is larger and more distended, this is the most massive star. It is also considerably brighter than this one. And so when this star, the red star, passes in front of the blue star, you see the large dip in the light output shown on the heart monitor here. But when the blue star passes in front of the red star, you see there's a small dip because there's a rather large difference in the brightness per unit surface area from the two stars. Okay, you can do things like turn on crosshairs, and then you can move the crosshairs, and you see it reads out X and Y positions. And the positions are actually an angle in milliarc seconds, so this is angle on the celestial sphere. Now, I won't go through the details, but there is actually sufficient information here to determine a lot about these two stars. In fact, from the information that is on the screen, and by tracking this animation, stopping it, using the crosshairs to determine carefully where things are at various times, it is possible, provided you know, say, Kepler's laws or the law of gravitation, it's possible to determine the total mass of this system. It's possible to determine the individual masses of those two stars. And it's also possible to determine the average density of those two stars just from the information that's being displayed here. So you can see, I won't go through the details, but you can see how you have a very rich possibility here for giving students something to really play with how Kepler's laws work in a binary star system. And in fact, you could be even more ambitious. You could even introduce conceptually Kepler's laws through this diagram by going stepwise through and asking students questions about what's happening and asking them to reason about what's happening instead of the traditional way in which we write some equations on the board and say that's Kepler's laws, and now we're going to explain what they do. Or we derive the equations and then we explain what they're going to do. That works fine for science students and engineering students. It doesn't work for non-science majors because as soon as you put an equation on the board, they faint. Or worse. Or worse, they go to drop dead. Or even worse, they go to the department head. Okay, so that's just another example. Now, how much time do I have left?
Oh, you've got 20 minutes.
20, okay.
Mike, are these all asynchronous delivery? Students can do this anytime?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing synchronous about this?
Right.
Okay.
Nothing here. You could attach synchronous stuff to it if you chose to, I guess. I mean, you could have webcasts of particular events associated with it or something like that. But everything that's here is available 24 hours a day to anybody who has a password and a web connection. And I mentioned earlier that it, of course, will work better if you have a faster connection, but this entire thing will actually work over a 56K modem. It won't be as nice as if you have something faster, but it's workable. And I have a cable modem now, but I used to have an ISDN. For many years I had an ISDN. It was fantastic over an ISDN. It's almost like it's sitting there on your computer over an ISDN.
How long does it take you to make a module like this?
This particular one, I actually did this one. I would guess if I set out to do this one now and I had all of the information at my fingertips that I needed, a day, something like that, some number of hours probably to do this and tune it up and get it just right. We have a number of people that are capable of turning out these kinds of things rather rapidly. We have quite a few people in our group that are funded by money from publishers to do this kind of stuff. That's actually a very important point. These kinds of technologies, which are the state of the art, and these kinds of things are not the kind of things that you can do in volume in your spare time at night. You have to have some resources in order to do it. And what we've been able to do in the case of the astronomy, the genetics, and biology is we have substantial resources from publishers in order to develop this, and so we have a number of people who can do this kind of programming. The Flash, which is what this one was done in, has the advantage in that besides the fact that it produces really nice-looking stuff, it has a fairly shallow learning curve compared to languages like Java, for example. And in fact, what has happened over the last 3 or 4 years, as Flash has gotten more and more capable, Flash now has a pretty robust object-oriented language associated with it called ActionScript. And it is now sufficiently capable that a lot of stuff that we used to do in Java, we do in Flash. And basically for 2 reasons. The first one is that it looks better typically in Flash than in Java. The visual aspects are usually better. But the second thing is we can teach students to program in Flash much faster than we can teach them to program in Java. And therefore, in the case of the astronomy, probably 20% of the interactive, maybe 30% of the interactive animation here is done in Java, and the rest is mostly done in Flash. But in the case of the genetics and biology, which I hope to get to in just a second, it's actually done 100% in Flash. In fact, there's nothing except Flash. It's probably the first 2 educational products ever produced that are entirely Flash. And what we found in the case of genetics and biology is that there wasn't anything that Flash couldn't do from a computational point of view. Everything that you needed to do could be done in Flash. It was easier for people to learn to use and visually looked better than Java, so we didn't use Java at all in those applications. We still need Java in the physical sciences for various things because Java is considerably faster. Flash is ActionScript is an object-oriented language. It's very nice, but it's interpreted. And therefore, it is slow if you have something that's computationally intensive. Java is considerably faster. So we still use Java for those things that require a lot of computation in educational technology. Essentially, everything else we're now doing in Flash. Okay, let's see. What was I going to show you?
You might comment, since you used to have an ISDN connection, was it 384?
Was it what?
384, how fast was it compared with the cable modem?
Oh, it was nominally 128 kilobits a second.
Okay.
But near the end, for some reason, it was running faster than that. I asked the ISDN people, they said they had no idea why, and certainly wasn't their fault. I mean, it wasn't just the numbers. I actually timed the download of files, and I found it was sometimes on FTP was running considerably faster than that, but typically 128 kilobits a second, whereas in the cable modem, I guess I get right now about a megabit a second, something like that on a download. It's a typical speed. So
you compared that with DSL?
I haven't directly, but there are 2 people in our astrophysics group. One of them has a cable modem and one of them has DSL, and they are getting about the same speed. At least with their setups, they're getting about the same speed with the download. But it depends on lots of things, I think. But it's certainly faster than the ISDN. That's offset partially by the ISDN connecting directly to UT, if you're connecting a lot to UT, whereas the cable makes some roundabout way to get to UT, but it's still faster. Okay, so let's see. Shall I show you some more here? There are lots of things I could show you. Do we have sound here? Yes. Maybe this one is interesting then. Let's go to
Volume control on the right down there.
okay.
Lower right.
Let me find the thing we're going to look for first. Okay, so let's see. This is partially cut off. There's some stuff on the bottom that I can't see, but I can find it here, I think. There are some menus on the bottom that pop up that are partially cut off here. Yes, we can get them, but yes. Oh, yeah, there they are. These things here. And one of the things that is here is a listing of with links of all of the interactive animations in the thing. And I was going to use this to find the one I'm looking for. this one, which is one that is pretty interesting. This fascinates a lot of people when they see it. What happened to it?
You can try it again.
Yeah, I must have,
Never got power blasted.
yeah, it should have launched in an external window, and it didn't. I must have not hit it right. 22.4. There we go. This is pulsar sounds. Pulsars are rapidly spinning neutron stars. Probably most of you know something about pulsars. They're rapidly spinning neutron stars that beam radiation of different kinds. Pulsars emit different kinds of radiation, but they beam radiation of different kinds in a lighthouse-type beam. And if that beam, as the star rotates rapidly, sweeps over the Earth, it's not actually a star. We refer to it as a neutron star, but it's actually the core of what's left over after a Type II supernova explosion. Extremely highly dense object. And it is, as it rotates rapidly, if the beam sweeps over the Earth, then we see a pulse. So there are many pulsars that are known. There are thousands of pulsars known now since their discovery in the 1960s. And here are three examples of a relatively slow pulsar. This one has almost a second, the period for the pulsation. This one is a much faster one. This is 89 milliseconds. And this is the fastest pulsar that's known. This is a 1 millisecond pulsar, a little over 1 millisecond. Well, all three of these, not all pulsars emit radio waves, but these do. And so you can detect these with a radio telescope, and you can take the signal from the radio telescope and feed it into an amplifier, and so you can listen to the pulsar. So that's what I want to show you now. So you think we have sound on here? Oh, yeah. So that's a slow pulsar. Let's try the faster one. This is the really funky one. Percussion section over there. This is the actual signal from a pulsar, which obviously has a lot of non-uniformity in this very fast signal. And then finally, this fastest pulsar that's known, this millisecond pulsar here, rotates 600 times a second. That's considerably faster than kitchen thunder, I think. And that's why you're hearing the kitchen thunder sound out of this. You have a Uro star sitting there rotating 600 times a second, and we're actually detecting pulses from a beam radio signal from the star. Well, I think this kind of thing is the sort of thing that I think really captures the imagination of especially kids. I mean, I know when I was a kid, if somebody had shown me this, I would have decided to become an astronomer immediately, I think, just because of the interest in things like this. So these kinds of technologies allow us to do some things like that we can't really do very well in a normal lecture or reading out of a textbook. I think what I should do is try to show you a little bit of the genetics as an example of something else in, let's see, is it here? Nope. But we can get it there probably. What is this one? Oh, there's a genetics, okay. So this is an example, this is the genetics project that we did for Prentice Hall. This was completed in late spring, and it's been on the market since middle summer, I think. And this is actually a completely wet delivered product too. It was originally supposed to be a CD-ROM when we first started on it. About a year ago is when we started on this and the biology project. It was originally supposed to be a CD-ROM, but in the middle of the project they decided that they wanted to turn it into a website, that things were going well, and they saw how small the files were going to be, and so they turned it into a website instead. Let's see. How do we get into it? There we go. It's off the bottom. So there's a chapter list. Let me just show you an example of some of the stuff we have here. this is going to get kind of deeply into genetics here, so if you don't know much about genetics, don't worry too much about it. But what I want to show you is whether you know genetics or not, I hope you can appreciate the kind of technique we're using here to help genetic students learn a very difficult concept. Genetics professors tell me that for introductory genetics, this idea of three-point mapping is one of the most difficult concepts that they have to teach, and it's clear why. It's a rather complicated concept, and it has to do with determining the location of genes on chromosomes. So schematically, this is a chromosome, and there are 3 genes on this chromosome, and the idea is to determine the relative position and separation of these genes on the chromosome. And in this particular example, these happen to be genes that are associated with the traits, with certain traits, fruit flies, Drosophila. And so let me skip through some introduction stuff here. Okay, so let me just, I don't want to go too deeply into stuff, but I got to tell you a little bit or it won't make any sense whatsoever. The idea is to look at some crosses here. So these are males and these are females, and these are pairs of chromosomes. And in the Drosophila example, the 3 so-called linked genes that are being examined in this case, linked because they are on the same chromosome, that are being examined in this case are called Y, W, and EC. And what those correspond to is the symbols without the pluses correspond to recessive mutations associated with, in the case of Y, it leads to a yellow body for fruit flies, whereas normally they have a dark body. How do I get rid of this guy?
Oh, somewhere else.
White eyes, because normally they have red eyes. And an eye shape is called echinus, because normally they have round, and I never have figured out exactly what echinus is, but it's some kind of slitted type eye, I think. And so the idea is to breed a generation and produce gametes here, and then to breed another generation and to see what happens in the next generation. That's what we're going to look at. And by careful sleuthing and understanding genetics, by looking at the phenotypes, that is the characteristics, the physical characteristics of the flies that you get in these generations, you can actually deduce both the order of the genes on the chromosome and the relative separation of the genes on the chromosome. So this is one of the examples of this core principle in genomics of trying to understand the gene structure on the chromosomes of living organisms. So let's go through a bit more introduction and get to the goodies. So the idea is that there is a table of information that a genetics student needs in order to deduce this information that we want to find out. Now, the way, I don't know if we'll have time to complete the table, so let me tell you the bottom line. The way it gets introduced in the textbook, I actually should have brought a copy of the textbook, is in the textbook there's a big table, I think it spreads across 2 pages in the textbook, that has a whole bunch of information. That table, actually, these are some of the columns, but only some of the columns in the table. And the way it's presented in the textbook is, here it is, and then there are 5 pages of explaining what the information in the table is, and explaining how step by step, if you construct all of that information, you can finally deduce the map of the genes on the chromosome. The approach that we've taken here, and that's sort of what you have to do with the textbook, the approach we've taken here is the opposite. We are going to force the students step by step to construct the table, starting from the very beginning, holding the student's hand, giving them sufficient information that if they're working hard, they should be able to figure out at that point how to construct various parts of the table, lead them through, and finally at the end they have constructed the table, and then they obtain the result. And our feeling is that's a much more robust way to learn a complicated topic like genetics than to start from the other direction. Here's a table, I have to figure out how the table was constructed. Genetics is pretty complicated. It is like a lot of other technical disciplines. I often compare it to physics, since I'm a physicist, well, actually I'm a chemist, but, or an astronomer, one or the other. But I teach in a physics department, and I often compare it to physics in the sense that it is the kind of discipline that you cannot learn by reading a book. It is sufficiently complicated and technical that you have to do a bunch of exercises in order to learn how to do it. Most aspects of engineering are the same way. You can't learn it by reading a book. You've got to do a bunch of problems. The same thing is true in genetics. It's just that the nature of the problems is somewhat different than in the physical sciences. So the first thing that one has to do is construct the possible gametes for this so-called F2 generation, which is now the next generation of fruit flies that you would get if you bred them. And these are the possible male gametes. Oh, the other thing I didn't tell you is that these particular traits are on the X chromosome of the fruit fly. And fruit flies have X and Y chromosomes, not exactly the same, but similar to humans, and they are sex-related as they are in humans. So this is on the X chromosome, and this is the standard symbol in genetics for the Y chromosome. So in the male gametes, you have one Y and one X, so these are the possibilities, and the genes we're interested in are only on the X, they're not on the Y chromosome. But in the female, we have two X chromosomes, and if that's all we had, then the possible gametes here are just this and this, where in this particular case, because of what we've bred to this point, we have here, in this case, these are all the recessive mutations in these three genes. These alleles of the genes are the recessive mutations, whereas these are the so-called wild types, that is the normal, the non-mutated version of the gene. But there is considerable complication in genetics because of what's called crossover. In meiosis, the process by which the gametes are formed, you can get crossover between genes in which two genes exchange genetic information. And here you see two examples of single crossover, that in this case, the two genes cross over at this point, and what you're actually going to end up with, this is a physical crossover. I probably won't have time, but there are places in here, micrographs, where you can actually see this taking place. This is a physical crossover, and what's going to happen here is that you're going to end up with a gene which has this allele of this, a chromosome, which has this allele of this gene and that and that. That is, you're going to get this out of it and you're going to get that out of it. So it leads to exchange of genetic information, these crossovers. This is very important because this is one of the fundamental sources of genetic diversity in the evolution of species. You can also have multiple crossovers. How much time? That's it? Yeah, okay. I'm out, right? Yeah. Is that what that means? Okay. You can also have multiple crossovers, where in this case you have crossovers between these and these. So the first step here, I'll finish this part and then I'll conclude. The first step here is that you have to determine what are the possible female gametes that can occur when you have these kinds of crossovers. So this requires substantial genetic knowledge in order to do this. So this is a drag and drop thing. So in this case, there's no crossover. So those are the ones that you get in that case. You can get hints. If you click on those things, you get hints. In this case, we're going to get YW plus EC plus. YW plus EC plus. Should be that one. This one, YWEC plus. Should be that one. And then obviously this must be the last one. And so that's what the student has to do. I didn't show you what happens if you make a mistake, but if you make a mistake, it jumps back to where it was and doesn't lock into place. And you get some sounds. And then once you do that, we actually then fill in the possible pairings of the male and female gametes that can originate from these possibilities. And you see the effect of crossover is that you get many complicated exchanges of genetic information that would not be there otherwise. Okay, so what you have to do from this point onward is you have to continue with this information, you continue filling this table out, and at each step you have additional genetic knowledge that you have to bring in. This is just the first of about 5 steps that you have to go through. and then finally you end up with the table, and at that point you actually are able to compute the separation of the 3 genes on the chromosome. So you can see this is an example of how, this is genetics, but you can see an example of how you can deal with a fairly complex topic in a technical discipline in some stepwise fashion with a lot of feedback for students. So I'll stop there.
Okay. We've got time. Students. We have time for maybe one question.
You said that you were developing these, but I mean, are these being used in courses here at UT that people get credit?
The genetics classes, introductory genetics is using this now. The biology that we developed is not on the market until January, but the introductory non-majors biology courses here, 1,500 students or so, I think are going to use it. And they, in fact, we gave them copies of the CD, so they're actually using it some this fall, but it's not on the market yet. So yeah, we're using the astronomy with about 600 students. In physics, the genetics is being used in genetics.
Now, students who are here, and not so much distance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we also have distance applications. In the astronomy, for instance, we have a true distance learning course that we just started up, and there are students using that online journey through astronomy fully at distance. But in this particular case, the genetics and biology, Prentice Hall asked us in that case to produce a companion to the textbook. So it's very different from the astronomy project, which is a standalone project. This is intended to be a companion to a textbook. Of course, it's also the first stage of a fully electronic genetics syllabus if you chose to do that.
Okay, Wesley?
The important question for students,
Yeah.
is it cheaper than the textbook?
In this case, it is, because although Prentice Hall has this password protected on their website, it's still on our website unpassword protected, so it's much cheaper. It's a complicated question because you have to ask which one of these. In the case of the genetics or biology, this is a companion to a textbook, so the pricing is largely set by the textbook itself in that case. In the case of the astronomy, I can answer the question more clearly. In principle, it should be cheaper. The pricing schedule, I say in principle, I'll tell you why. The pricing schedule for Online Journey Through Astronomy, for the cheapest version of it, there are several versions of it corresponding to different organizations and materials. The cheapest version, the pricing was something like $46, whereas the typical astronomy textbook is probably $70 or $80. But that was a price for e-commerce purchase. Now, there are two problems with that. First is not many people are ready to buy by e-commerce yet. The number's increasing, but not many people are. And even more important, Brooks Co. hasn't implemented their e-commerce server yet, and therefore it is not available by e-commerce. And now it's only being sold through the bookstores, and then it gets marked up to a price closer to textbook. But in principle, it should be cheaper. But, can I add something to that? Of course. But you should also bear in mind that when you buy a textbook and you don't intend to keep it, you can sell it back to the bookstore for some fraction, whereas in this case, the publishers just love this. In this case, there's nothing to sell back, right, because it's password protected. And in the case of the astronomy, the password is good for a semester or 2 semesters, depending on how it's marketed, and then it expires.
So if it expires, you cannot have access to the book for those that way.
Well, if you just buy that version of it, the thing that I have discussed a number of times with the publisher, which they all agree is something to be done, but they haven't implemented it yet. This has only been on the market in the last year of the astronomy, is that you should have the option of a lifetime purchase, which would mean something like you pay a little bit more, and then you get the privilege of, on a yearly basis, paying a small fee, $5 or something like that, to get an updated password. Well, but you should, because you should pay for that, because think of what you're getting. It's like keeping your textbook, but the publisher sending you a new version of the textbook every year. That's very different than when I look on my shelf and look at 30-year-old textbooks that I kept when I was a student. But they haven't actually implemented that yet. It is in the works, but it hasn't been implemented.
Okay, we do have a few visitors today, and I should inform you that we have refreshments downstairs on the second floor, and you are, of course, invited to join us for refreshments. Dr. Guidry will be down there to answer your questions. Before we adjourn for refreshments, let's express our appreciation again. Okay, thank you.
Besides, Mike, a lot of those 30-year-old physics books, that is the most recent edition.